Hello and welcome back to Accessibility Unlocked. Color plays a crucial role in visual design. But often when we think about the impact of color, we focus on how it shapes a user's impression of your brand or how it can be effectively used to highlight certain parts of your web page. Today, we're going to talk about why the colors you choose go beyond that and can determine whether your website is not just visually appealing, but perceivable by everyone, especially users with visual impairments. The proper use of color and contrast can make the difference between a website that's easy to use and navigate and one that's challenging or even completely unusable for some people. Different people perceive colors differently. Users with low vision, color blindness, or even those in temporary situations like bright sunlight may struggle to see elements on the page. Let's take a look at how we can get this right. Here I have an example of a website that has a lot of different kinds of elements on it. There's a large heading, lots of buttons, subheadings, and even some icons. But let's focus our attention on this section for a bit. Notice how the different service headings, web development, SEO optimization, and digital marketing are using a dark purple color that really stands out against the white background. And this helps us notice it and read it better. The additional text underneath it is using a lighter gray that doesn't stand out as much. Now, although I can see it, for users with certain visual impairments, the light gray color can start to blend into the white background, which can be really challenging for them to perceive clearly. So, how do we ensure our colors are accessible? The key is to carefully consider the contrast ratio of content on the page. But what exactly is contrast ratio, and how do we know if we've got it right? Well, simply put, it's essentially the difference in brightness between the foreground elements like text and the background colors of the page. The higher the contrast, the greater the ratio and the easier it is to read the text against its background. Contrast ratio doesn't just apply to text, but to all the visual elements on a page, including buttons, icons, or images. Now, according to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG for short, the industry standard for web accessibility, for normal text that you would generally use in the body or paragraphs of your web page, a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1 is recommended. For larger text that's generally easier to read, you want to aim for at least a ratio of 3 to 1. But we don't need to calculate these ratios ourselves. Using some easily available online tools such as the WebAIM Contrast Checker, I can plug in my foreground and background colors and check whether they meet the minimum required contrast ratios as recommended by WCAG. Let's take a look at how we can use this tool to check whether our color combinations are good enough. In this example, the button is using a light blue text color placed on top of a slightly darker blue button background, which makes it difficult to see. Let's check their contrast ratios. By plugging in the values into the foreground and background colors, I'm able to see that my color combination only has a contrast ratio of 2.03 to 1, which is not enough to meet the minimum required of at least 4.5 to 1. By slightly adjusting the lightness, I can get it up to the minimum requirement. And there you go. And there you have it. By slightly adjusting the brightness or saturation of my colors, I was able to bring up the contrast ratio to the minimum requirement. Not only is the text much easier to read now, but I can also be confident that users with certain visual impairments will be able to see the text as well. Let's look at a couple of other elements on the website. Although it looks like the yellow is quite bright and stands out well against the white and dark backgrounds, I can't really be sure. Let me check its contrast ratio. The minimum required contrast ratio for non-text elements like buttons and icons is at least 3 to 1. And using the contrast checker tool, I can see that the yellow against the slightly light gray is only 1.76 to 1. So although the yellow looks like it stands out quite well against the light gray, you can't really be sure, and it's always a good idea to check. Let's look at that example again. It's worth noting that placeholder text inside form field is not exempt from the contrast requirement. I'm checking the contrast ratio between the search placeholder text against its background, which is the search field. The contrast ratio is 4.41 to 1. which is just below the required 4.5 to 1 ratio. It's important to note that ratios cannot and should not be rounded up and need to meet the exact recommended number according to WCAG. Coming back to our example from before, it's important to consider text that is being placed on top of complex images behind it. For example, the main heading of the page, "Take Your Business to the Next Level," seems to stand out, but the subheading, "Your Success is Our Mission," is getting lost in the image behind it. By simply being intentional with our placement, by moving the heading to a less busier part of the image, we can immediately improve its readability. Make sure that you're really considering all the use cases of your website. For users who prefer dark mode or high contrast mode, you want to make sure that the contrast ratio of all the elements on the page is still sufficient against the darker colors. Good color contrast doesn't just help users with permanent visual impairments, but really helps everyone. Our vision declines over time as a natural part of aging, and devices with different screen sizes and resolutions can affect screen contrast. Really considering good color accessibility makes sure that everyone can see content clearly. And there you have it, folks. Now you can make your color choices with confidence. And remember, small changes can make a big difference. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more tips on Accessibility Unlocked.